Hi, Judy.
Hi, Rabbi.
How are you?
Hanging in.
All right, nice to see you.
I'm glad you're doing
Oh,
this.
I see Rita. Here's Rita Samel, Michael. Rita is logging in. Wonderful.
The matriarch.
Absolutely. Wouldn't be the same without Rita.
Oh.
All right. So as more people begin to file in here, I just want to say hello and thank everyone for joining us. If you have food, if you have coffee, take out your food, take out your coffee. This is supposed to be a break. I've got my iced coffee here. I always have my iced coffee. Take out your food, take out your coffee. The idea is we all need a break in the middle of our afternoons, in the middle of our weeks, and we've been meeting here. I'm expecting a larger crowd because we have a special guest, so I'm inviting everybody in. We have been meeting here because we have been trying to create a space where we can have dialogue, we can disagree, but have it be a safe space, a gathering space, so that we can talk about the COVID, the hot button issues that are coming up now, and to make sure that we have a space for genuine dialogue. And there is someone who I met early on when I moved into San Francisco who welcomed me very quickly and very openly. He invited me, Rita, Sam L, and Michael Pappas invited me to breakfast, and then they invited me to come speak to the council, the San Francisco Interfaith Council. And it was a wonderful gathering space where I felt more love and spirituality. The most amount of love and spirituality I think I have was my first really felt it, and a real sense of community. And Michael, what Michael doesn't know is that for the past week, one of the things that I've been sharing with our community is how blessed I feel and my wife feels at this moment to be here in San Francisco, to be a part of a neighborhood and a part of a community with the leadership that we have, and with the sense of values and outlook that we have upon the world. So every day that passes, as hard as the situation is all over the country, I think we are particularly blessed here. So I just want to begin by counting blessings. And then I'm going to spotlight people as they talk. So just so everyone knows how we're going to do this, I'm going to introduce Michael. And then we're going to begin with a conversation about COVID. So Michael has really been running, I've been calling him the point person for all of the San Francisco clergy. He has been my point person for understanding how a synagogue should respond in San Francisco to the shelter-in-place rules, how we can think about reopening our synagogue, and ultimately, as we move towards the high holidays, I'm sure Michael knows that's on the forefront of a lot of our minds. And so Michael is going to share a little bit about how the religious communities in San Francisco have been handling COVID. And we're going to give space so that people have a chance to ask questions here. I see we have a large crowd, so feel free to either raise your hand or put it into the chat, and our moderator will be able to trigger us so that we can all have a chance to ask a question. And then after we talk about the COVID situation, obviously, we want to talk about the protests that are happening now, and how religious communities, a community like ours, we all know, I'm sure Michael knows, Rabbi Saul White of blessed memory was the first clergy member here in San Francisco to march down Market Street with the Torah, protesting the war in Vietnam. That is an integral and essential part to how we understand ourselves as a Jewish community. And so we're going to talk about how do we respond to both a pandemic and to what we feel is a call for justice and a righteous call that all of us need to respond to. So let me first spotlight Michael and introduce him. So Michael Pappas is the executive director of the San Francisco Interfaith Council. He has a master's of divinity, and he's been a wonderful friend to our community and to the religious communities here in San Francisco. And I just wanted to open by inviting you to share a little bit about the work that you've been doing prior to COVID and then this past year.
First and foremost, Rabbi Dan, I want to thank you. You've brought so many gifts to San Francisco. You have been a blessing. I am a great admirer of your congregation. I've been blessed to know your predecessors, and I just working with you has just been a gift. And so thank you for this invitation. It's a great opportunity to talk to the folks who are impacted because their lives have been interrupted. And so I want to say a special thank you. I want to especially acknowledge Rita Semmel here because Rita was really the founder and the past chair of our council. And our council was founded out of two crises: a homeless crisis that was emerging 30 years ago and the Loma Prieta earthquake. And so both response to the homeless crisis, which ended up in hosting an interfaith winter shelter that's in its 31st year now, and disaster preparedness they've been two of our core missions. And I think that speaks to why we are so involved right now. And I'll just take you back to February 27th, when the city proclaimed the state of emergency. At that point, the Department of Emergency Management activated something called the community branch. And the community branch is basically a cohort of stakeholders from all different sectors in San Francisco who are assigned to help in the response effort. Because of our work with both the homeless and disaster preparedness, we were designated as the liaison to San Francisco's 800 communities of faith and religious institutions. And what that meant was that from the outset, we were responsible for conveying all of the official statements and communications, the aggressive recommendations that then went into public health orders that altered our lives pretty dramatically, most especially with shelter in place and use of masks and the like. So what we did from the beginning was we wanted to make sure, because we have 5,000 e-subscribers, and we have a very active faith leaders list, which Rabbi Dan is on, and we wanted to make sure that this information got into their hands early so that the planning they could do to have a continuity of worship of some sort could happen. Having come from a Greek Orthodox tradition, I have to tell you, I empathize with the challenges that Beth Shalom has as a conservative congregation. I know that this has not been easy because of the Shabbat. We have just tried very, very hard to be the messenger. I will tell you, as I travel around town and I see boarded up storefronts that have had to close, with the exception of a few congregations, most of them were able to pivot to online worship and virtual ministry literally overnight. So they never had to really shut down. There was always sort of a continuity. What we're hearing now is some of them are, their attendance is up, and in many cases their giving is up. And I will be very honest with you, a lot of the congregations in San Francisco are reticent to rush to reopen.
Yes, this is what I wanted to talk about. Tell me more about that. Yeah. And for a number of reasons. We had a very robust conversation around our boardroom table for the Interfaith Council board, but beyond that, we're in contact with some of the anchor institutions in San Francisco. And what we were hearing is that, well, first and foremost, I think nobody wanted to expose vulnerable folk in their community to this disease. That was their pastoral response. At our congregations, a number of the people who are either staff, volunteers, or congregants are elderly, have pre-existing conditions, and so that was an initial concern. The other concern was that they didn't have the capacity or the bandwidth to monitor and enforce social distancing, PPE wearing, sanitation at their congregations, and they were concerned about, who was going to come and having to turn people away. So those have been all elements. The other element is that no one wants to be responsible for a surge, and what will happen is if through contact tracing
someone can trace that they were at worship, both the congregation leader as well as all of those who could be identified who were there when that person was there would have to go into quarantine for a minimum of 2 weeks. Additionally, as I said, nobody wants to be the source of a resurgence, and we are told that is going to happen. So those are some of the concerns. What we have also been doing, in addition to what I shared with you, is we've been harvesting, compiling, and disseminating on our website all of the official communications of congregation leaders to their congregants, so that best practices can be seen, so that perhaps some of the congregations who don't have the resources that some of the larger ones have can see what sort of communications and what sort of precautions are being taken. All of the,
yeah, no, you finish. No, you finish.
No, and I wanted to say from the get-go too, our sector is very much on the radar of our civic partners. From the get-go, Speaker Pelosi wanted to have a conversation with and brief faith leaders, as did the mayor. And we also were given a tech team. So every week, the San Francisco Interfaith Council hosts what we call an online briefing for faith leaders, not unlike this, where we bring in a civic partner to talk about the impact of the COVID-19 on a particular aspect of San Francisco life. And then we have 3 faith panelists who will show how their lives have been impacted and ask a question of that person.
Yeah, we've been finding very similar results here in our community. You can see we have almost 40 people here for our lunch and learn. I did this lunch downtown, and I would get an average of 6 to 8 people. So this has definitely helped in terms of attendance numbers, and people definitely feel the desire to be a part of a community. And what we've been trying to do is provide opportunities 6 days out of the week for people to touch in, either like this or people who might be first responders, or people who might be home with children, or who might be living alone, that people can congregate. What can you tell us? Tell me if I have, so it's a lot of information that I get from you, and I actually used to be a lawyer, and that comes in handy, but it is complicated. So according to the mayor, on June 15th, right, I can open the synagogue, and I think, like our congregation, a lot of the leaders of this congregation are not enthusiastic to be the first community to open for all of the reasons that you've expressed. And I think some of the concerns that people have are, if the state tells us to open but we don't open, what are the metrics by which we implement as a community to decide what level of comfort we are going to go with so that we can open? My concern is, once we establish a greater standard than the one given by our county, how do we come to sort of understanding around when the community's values is to open? And I'm curious if you can share experiences from other congregations.
It might be helpful also to talk a little bit about process, because from the get-go, the Governor Newsom engaged faith leaders. I was on a call with about 100 faith leaders of diverse traditions from throughout the state, and he was soliciting input. And from that time on, what we started doing, because we knew that congregations were having internal conversations and judicatories were having internal conversations, so we started harvesting all of the reports of what they thought they needed to do in order to reopen. And we submitted that. I sit on something called the Economic Recovery Task Force. So these questions are being asked of all sectors of San Francisco in terms of reopening. And so what I did was, not only did we answer the questions that the Economic Recovery Task Force wanted, but we have amassed a cadre of reports from all different judicatories and faith traditions. And we submitted them not only to the task force, but I submitted them personally to the director of the Department of Public Health, so they could have a context, and to the governor's office. Some of them have been really, really well thought out. And I want to thank Pam Friedman. I don't know if she's on this call Rabbi Pam because she was very helpful in getting us from the Jewish community some of the very important particular details. So we made those available both to the city and county of San Francisco as well as to the governor's office. Most recently, the governor issued what he calls guidelines. And those guidelines were very helpful to give congregations a sense of some of what they can anticipate in opening up. But as I've told people, that as you're watching all the information we're sending out, as the city is beginning to open up, what you're going to see is for each sector, the public health officer, in concert with the city attorney, is issuing revisions to the public health orders. And those are legal and binding, and those are very specific. And so what we're seeing now is the June 15th date. I'm hoping and I'm praying that we will get the revisions to the public health orders in advance of that, so that the congregations will have enough time. But I want to tell you, from what I have seen, the congregations have probably been more proactive in their preparatory precautions than even the public health orders will be. I think that worship is going to be different. And I think that is something that we need to prepare our congregants for, that, our faiths are tactile. We touch each other, we hug, we sing. And I think what you're going to see is, at least for a little while, religion is going to be a little socially distant. But we should get, we will have that in advance. Now, the question is, and this is a conversation I'm in right now, will the congregations be required to submit plans as is suggested in the governor's guidance? And there's a question as to the feasibility and the capacity to do that. I think that what the onus is going to be on the congregations to be able to monitor and enforce, and to be held accountable at some level for adhering to the prescriptions that both the state and the city are going to recommend for the safety of others. That's going to all happen very soon. It has to, in order to meet that June 15th date.
Is your church opening? Are there other churches that are planning on opening in the next couple of weeks?
Everybody is waiting to hear what the city is going to ask. I will tell you, I think some of the more sacramental churches, like the Roman Catholic Church and the Greek Orthodox Church, are probably in the queue to do that faster than anyone else. From what I'm hearing is, and all of the guidelines are encouraging online worship as a precaution, and they're encouraging vulnerable sectors of communities to stay home for their own benefit and safety and protection. I think that you're going to see a continuation of online services as people ease into worship again. There's issues of ventilation. There's issues, as we said, of PPE. There's issues of sanitation.
Singing apparently is one of the things. And blowing a shofar, I think, and blowing a shofar all around a congregation is probably the worst thing you can do.
Probably, it's up there with a couple of others. Big. What we've seen too, though, is that in some other counties where, like on Mother's Day, I think it was in Butte County, against the public health order, the pastor opened up, and I want to say that 80 people, were tested positive shortly after that. It's a matter of concern, and I don't think that the religious community wants to be the source of a resurgence.
Yeah, okay, so I'm open to questions. If anybody wants to put questions, I do want to let people know they're free to welcome. I have a couple more, but I don't want to ask all of the questions. They're welcome to ask questions about this topic, and then we are going to go to George Floyd and talk about, and talk about.
I'm sorry, yeah. Rabbi, but there's a cross-section between the pandemic and the protests that we're seeing now that I'm hoping we can discuss as well.
Yeah, so I guess what I'm wondering just about the COVID situation. Is a lot of our congregation has been, we love our congregation and they've been very committed to Beth Shalom for a very long time. And some of them are in the age in which they were at a higher risk for it. And some have ailments in which they are at a higher risk for it. And some tell me they don't care. And so then I wonder what responsibility, how are other congregations sort of sorting out this, if they do all of the due diligence, if they create the thermometer check, if we do all of the swabs, if we have all the face masks, and then there's somebody who is just there who just shouldn't be there. What responsibility do congregations have to an individual like that?
And I think that that is a big issue. Thank you for raising that, because nobody wants to be a police officer. And I think that that is part of the reticence of reopening up, because you don't know, I have the unique privilege of going to all different kinds of congregations. And the one thing that I know is that congregations are hospitals for wounded souls. And so people come that need help. And sometimes their mental capacity is not all, intact. And congregations have been so sensitive to welcoming people. But in this situation, it could put people's lives at risk. And I think that that is a concern. I wanted to say, Rabbi, I have a question for you regarding the COVID. I've had the privilege of going to Israel 4 times. And every time I go and I stand at the wall, the Western Wall, and I look up, I know that perhaps there is an aspiration to rebuild the temple. But at some point, and being of the Greek Orthodox faith, I've stood in Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, and I know that the Greek Orthodox have this aspiration to reclaim it as a church. Because of circumstances, they were not able to. What amazes me is the resilience of the Jewish people and the capacity to adapt and adjust. And really the 40 years in the wilderness, I think, could be very instructive to San Francisco.
Amen.
Right now. I mean, we are a diaspora. We're not in our houses of worship.
Amen. I think that analogy. Hi, Samson, say hello. Samson, Shimmy, say hi to Michael Pappas. I'm in a conversation with him. We're talking about religion. So, but it's good to see you, Samson. So I think that's exactly right. And I think the analogy is well put. We find ourselves in the book of the Torah that's called Bamidbar, which means into the wilderness. And here we are on this 40-year journey. We've been expelled. We left. We achieved freedom out of Egypt, and then we're making our way to the promised land, but there's this huge in-between space. And I think sometimes the hardest part is for me to tell community members, we will get past this. We will get to a promised land. We'll be able to hug and kiss and have weddings and simchas again, but we're really utilizing the wealth and the wisdom of our tradition, which was established in the diaspora, which figured out how to create rituals and keep community together in unorthodox and unusual circumstances, is what has united us over thousands of years. And it's been very powerful to do that. And we're not in our physical home, but it's been very powerful to be on this diaspora and to be in this home here. So I just want to pause here because I see that there is a question. So I'm going to cancel the spotlight video for a moment and let me go Ben Chin. I see Ben Chin had his hand raised. Ben, where are you? So your question is.
Hi, and Michael, thanks so much for being with us today. It's really great to hear from you. So I have a question kind of about this in-between space, right? Because as you mentioned, online worship is still being encouraged, even as things open up. And at Beth Shalom, so much of the virtual programming we have is not really a replacement for what we were doing on site, but sort of, I don't know, orthogonal to that in some way, right? Because we don't encourage the use of electronic devices on Shabbat, on the Sabbath itself, right? We've added a lot of programming sort of around that space and time and on other days of the week. And a lot of it's been very successful, and I don't see us stopping doing that. So I guess my question is, in terms of what you're hearing from other communities, I mean, number one, what you spoke a little bit about how the virtual programming people are doing is, you know, how that's working. I'd love to hear a little bit more about that and about the opportunities people are seeing with that kind of programming. And also what you're seeing and hearing in terms of how the stuff online and the stuff maybe as we open up a little bit, how people are thinking about that coexisting, either temporarily or even longer term.
For some of them, I'm hearing it's an equity issue, and that people who cannot physically make it to worship now are on the same plane with everybody else in the congregation. And so from that equity issue, that has, I mean, theologically, it is allowing everybody to be the same. And so that is one element. I think that, you know, I was asked just before Passover and Easter by the mayor to speak at one of her press briefings. There was a concern that there might be some rogue congregations that would, you know, go ballistic. And I used the opportunity really to commend our faith leaders who were able to facilitate actually community in the midst of isolation. Because what I really think is going to be the bigger issue is going to be, and this is going to be the role of the faith leaders in this town, is just as people were not navigated into isolation, they're going to have to be navigated back into community and connectivity. And I see, Rabbi Dan, it's going to be a heavy burden on your shoulders. I think we're going to have the people who are coming back. Another issue to be conscious of is there's going to be huge unemployment and huge economic devastation. You know, in just the course of 1 week, the city budget deficit, anticipated to be $1.7 billion, has now risen to almost $2.1 billion. And I remember during the recession that the impact this had on everybody, and we had only a $400 million budget deficit back then. And so how are we going to take care of the neediest of the needy?
Amen.
And they're in our pews.
Amen.
I think that the bigger questions are going to be, in a couple of weeks, you're going to have permission and you'll figure out how to do it. Not as many people will be able to come into the congregation. You have a beautiful sanctuary. I love going there. I'm inspired by it. But right now, the maximum, I think, will be 100, as I remember correctly from the.
That's right.
And you won't be able to be close. But think about what San Francisco is going to look like, and the one thing that amazes me about the Jewish community, and I learned this through Rita, is that from the beginning, this has been like the New Jerusalem. The Jewish community, in its philanthropic efforts, in its educational efforts, its cultural efforts, has really branded San Francisco and made it the very special place that it is. And I think that now the Jewish community is going to have to say, okay, we have a new challenge in front of us.
Yeah.
And how are we going to contribute back? I don't know if I answered your question.
No, that was beautiful. I want to now, Judy Stein has a question, and then after her question, I'd love to pivot and go into the nexus between the COVID and the current crisis of justice going on at the moment. Judy, your question.
Yeah, my question kind of builds on what Ben said. If we have congregations that are holding services but are not streaming them, are we creating inequities in that congregation? People who cannot participate, not because they don't want to be there, but because of other issues, reasons why they shouldn't be there.
Yeah, so that's a beautiful question. Thank you. So, yeah, did I cut you off, Judy? No, you can continue.
No. That's what I wanted to talk
I think that's a wonderful question.
And it's the most painful one for me to have to answer because you know, our council is a respecter of religions, and I think that adhering to traditions is a part of who the Jewish people are. and especially how beautifully that they are, the continuity through the generations has been kept through the conservative expression of this faith. It's a difficult question. Another question might be is, this technology wasn't around when the laws were written, and so what would the intent be? I had a conversation with Rabbi Dan the other day. I said, when I was in seminary, my dogmatics professor, the only thing I remember that he said was that all theology is pastoral. And the intent is to bring people to God and to do it in the ways that we need to do it. This has been rough for a lot of people. It has been rough for a lot of people. But I think in the creativity that I've witnessed by our faith leaders, they are realizing things about their own ministry they never thought they had the capacity to do.
That's right. I think that's exactly right. And I think rabbis are not just rabbis, but all clergy are discovering their voice in a lot of this, just out of necessity. Whenever you limit the bandwidth that you're able to work with, it really sharpens people's creativity. And it's been amazing to see that sort of innovation happening in the religious sector. What I want to ask is, as we innovate and as we create new ways to serve people, you had spoke about this COVID serving as a nexus between the justice crisis that we have now. And as we're balancing these issues and speaking about clergy and how they're finding their voice in all of this, they're finding their voice out protesting. And that I feel very, I shared with you the letter that I sent out to my community. We are creating these programs. We're creating spaces to dialogue. People want to help, but they can't go outside. They want to address the systemic injustices that exist in our world. And yet I haven't opened my synagogue for a minyan in 3 months. How are clergy negotiating these two? And I want to invite you to begin to share that nexus and address some of these questions now.
Some people initially thought that the COVID was going to be the great equalizer, that everybody was going to be equal because of this. We've all lost, a lot of people have lost jobs. We're all sheltering at home. We're experiencing a lot of the same things. And so people said, oh, we're all in the same boat. Somebody corrected that statement and said, we're not in the same boat. We're in the same storm. And I think what the COVID has done is it's accentuated the equity disparities. We see that in terms of the pandemic itself, those who are succumbing are from low income and racial disparity communities. Economically, absolutely. And now we're seeing this rise up through the protests. I want to take us back just a couple of years ago to the emergence of the Black Lives Matter movement, because we as a council were asking ourselves, what is the role of faith leaders now in the civil rights movement, now that we have this new movement? And so at the University of San Francisco, we hosted a symposium. We had Black Lives Matter people there. They were kind of shocked to be invited because they're not very great admirers of organized religion. But we also invited Clarence Jones, who was Martin Luther King's attorney, and he actually transported from the Birmingham jail the pieces of toilet paper, newspaper to create the letter from the Birmingham jail. And he told this story, and in a very brief few sentences, he was able to translate the Black Lives Matter movement to a predominantly white audience. And this is what he said. He goes, you know what the problem of being around so long is? He goes, you see too much. And he goes, for instance, back in the 1980s, 1990s, primarily the early 1980s, we had an administration. There was this new disease that didn't even have a name yet, and the administration not only failed to, but refused to respond. And so a movement called ACT UP formulated all over the globe, but here most especially in the United States. And they showed up unwelcomed, and they showed up loud, uninvited, And he said, thank God they did, because more people would be dead if they hadn't been. And so we see, right there, the beginning of just an example of that nexus with the AIDS crisis that we can, that really kind of explains the Black Lives Matter movement, just as it manifested in the ACT UP movement. I will tell you what followed that, because you have these conferences, everybody's happy, they go home, and now what? Well, what we realized was everybody wants to do, but we questioned whether they wanted to do for the right intent. And so at that time, I was on the Human Rights Commission here in the city, and we were mandating that law enforcement undergo implicit bias training. And just to make sure that their intentions were right and that they were sensitive to how they were responding neurologically in a critical situation. It just so happened that the commissioners had to take this too, and it was almost as painful, Dan, as CPE, clinical pastoral education. But it was challenging. And so what we did is we contracted with the same person who was working with the city to train the officers, to train faith leaders, to make sure that their intent was in the right place.
Wow.
And I think that as we want to protest, as we want to do all of these things, I think we have to come to terms with our own privilege. I think we have to come to terms with our own implicit bias if we're going to really make the change. Because quite honestly, it is not our African-American sisters and brothers who are going to make the change. It's going to be us who makes the change.
Yeah.
We see the allyship out there now. We see the stories being told. I have to be very honest with you. You mentioned it right out at the outset. I was on the steps of City Hall the other day. Social distancing was not the norm, either on the stage or and we're seeing these crowds throughout the country. My big concern, and I've spoken to people in the Department of Emergency Management, it's their concern too, that we could see a resurgence of this virus just because of the protests.
Yeah, even if the intentions are good, you could end up harming more people just by being perhaps an asymptomatic carrier in good faith. Yeah, I have a question that came through on the chat, which says, my daughter says all police are bad. Is there anything I could say to help her understand that there are good ones and bad ones?
There are good people and bad people on this earth. And I think the police department is a microcosm. It's interesting. I just received today, because a friend of mine, his brother is a law enforcement officer from another county who has been brought into San Francisco to assist in just keeping the law and keeping the peace. Officers are authority figures, and in some cases, and we've seen them here in San Francisco, where there's been an excessive use of police force, and it has resulted in death, and it has resulted in pain in communities. I speak to these mothers who have lost their children. The mayor just said at the steps of City Hall, her cousin died at the hands of a police officer from the SFPD. And this was shocking to hear. And she said, I'm the mayor of the city, but I'm a Black woman who grew up in the projects here. I think that we have, in the person of Chief William Scott, an incredible police officer, an incredible chief of police. He is under extreme pressure because you have a police officers association, which is putting pressure on him to take care of the police. And then on the other side, you have those who don't want to be abused by the police. And so I think his job is not an easy one. We have Officers for Justice, which is an African-American cadre of police officers. And what I've seen is in the different neighborhoods, and I would suggest this to you in your neighborhood, to invite the police to come to the synagogue when you're able to.
When it's open, right? Yeah.
And create relationships, because I think that in each neighborhood, it's happening at some degree. I mean, whenever you have an event, you call the police just to let them know what you're doing. But the more you develop those relationships, the more the walls come down, And the more that you can work together for the good of the city, I think that is going to be critical moving out of this.
It's been very powerful for me to come to San Francisco and to be involved with your Interfaith Council. And you sent out a very powerful letter that both myself and Rabbi Russell co-signed. I want to know, what is the impact of clergy speaking out? What's the impact of a Jewish clergy person writing a letter and sending it out? I think there's a lot of pressure to do things like that and to make statements. I know it matters to speak to my community and to provide a space for dialogue, but I want to talk more about the power of what you do, putting together interfaith groups and having them share a letter.
I will tell you, the people that you write letters to, community. I look at Nancy Pelosi. I look at the mayor. They are very, very, very cognizant.
They are.
For better or for worse, we are able to offer a moral and prophetic voice. And that very, very, very powerful role. We have. I think that these statements that we put out, you give, and the messages we put out are critical to making San Francisco a better place. And they do not fall on deaf ears. They do not fall on deaf ears. And, if you saw the long list of people, and I can't thank you and the clergy.
It was very powerful to see all of those names together. Yeah.
At Beth Shalom for adding your name. Dan Ain is the host now. I see that.
I'm back. That was my computer. Thank you. So just a little bit of so I think I'm back now. Just a little bit of technical trouble that we've been working through. And what I heard was that the letters don't fall on deaf ears. And I think, one of the things that I have been saying is that we can disagree about, well, naturally, we're going to disagree about how do we take our services and our prayer rituals and do we bring them online, and how do we adapt our services? And this is a part of a Talmudic discourse that Jews have been having for thousands of years, is deciding what we want to include and what we don't want to include and how to make it work. But with regard to how we treat individuals, with regard to, I saw that George Floyd video, and it looked as bad as anything that I could see in Nazi Germany. And to not have that response and to not want to respond to that, I think we're not going to fight over that. We central to being Jewish is the value of every human being. Susie has a question that she would like to ask.
Yes, hi. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm wondering, as the leader of the Interfaith Council, whether there is any movement to attend one another's services, even remotely. Obviously, we can't do it in person right now, but as a way of showing support, bearing witness, and frankly, educating ourselves to the voice of African Americans with whom we don't typically rub shoulders. Is there any way that we can be supportive just by zooming into other people's services?
Thank you, Susie.
Thank you for asking that question, because you give me an opportunity to offer a public service announcement. One of the things, well, let's go back before all of this. The rabbi asked me a question before we even started, what was going on before. And it's interesting, we've received some funding from the Walter and Elise Haas Fund and Stephanie Rapp has been an amazing program officer to us. But we've been working on security in houses of worship because, as you know, there was a string of terrorist attacks, not only all over the globe, but here in the United States. And what would happen would be the attack would happen, and then there'd be a vigil. And the vigils were overnight. And I remember standing, Rabbi Dan, you and I stood shoulder to shoulder. I think it was at Congregation Emmanuel when I think
after Pittsburgh. That's right.
I think you had just arrived, maybe, but that's how I think we met. And the Interfaith Council worked very closely with Congregation Emmanuel, and I remember it was on a Sunday morning too,
right.
During worship services for the Christians, but there were 1,800 people in that sanctuary. And I remember standing up there and saying, today we are all Jewish, because the one thing that happens in these times of crisis is we naturally come and stand by the sides of one another. And that has been sort of a hallmark of the work of the Interfaith Council for the last 30 years. In this period where we're gathering virtually, what we started doing early on is we started collecting the links to the online services of one another's worship. And so we put that out every day with what we call the daily update from the mayor's office. So it exists there. I have to confess to you, I have not gone and examined it very carefully, and I don't know how many of our African-American congregations, here's another issue of inequity, if they have the resources to be doing this. And so I have to confess to you that I don't know what's on there, and I don't know if you are able to do that right now. I know that the African-American community is feeling allyship from our communities of faith, because for them, their only sense of power has been the pulpit in the good tradition of Dr. King. And so for them, their communities of faith are the anchors. So when people from other faiths come and join and stand arm in arm with us, like we were the other day at City Hall, it is not only a relief, it's a comfort, it is a support. And I think that you really hit the nail on the head, though, to become educated as well as to be there. It's not as easy to be there right now. But what you have done, though, is given me a homework assignment, and that is to investigate our houses of worship. Now, I'm going to be on a line with a number of the African-American clergy in the Bayview Friday, and I'm going to ask this question just so we can make sure that we have the links to make available to you.
Yeah, and I just want to let you know, Michael, that this coming Friday, one of our community efforts has been to bring in prayer leaders from the Bay Area, and Terry Odabi, who is a blues singer, who is a part of the Church of Jazz and Justice in Oakland and has participated in our services, is coming to our Friday evening service so that we can bring her here. But I love what Susie is saying. Can we find other avenues so that, yes, Susie, you have a follow-up. Go right ahead.
I have a follow-up question. I was also, Bob and I were also at the interfaith demonstration on Monday. I think it was Monday.
Or was it?
Yeah. And maybe the most striking thing that I heard was the organizer, Felicia Jones, I think is her name, indicated that her own organization didn't have the technical ability to set up a Zoom call or to have a website. And without a website, of course, it's very hard to raise money. And I thought, how basic is that? I'm wondering whether in it may be because there were a lot of young people at that demonstration, it may be that somebody ran up to her afterwards and said, let me help. But I wonder if, we might, in our community, we have a lot of tech savvy people. I'm not one of them, unfortunately. But I wonder if we might reach out to her to offer our assistance, because how easy it is to set up a Zoom meeting, really.
So, and so there was a dynamic at that gathering because there were two organizers. There was Reverend Brown
Yes.
from Third Baptist and Felicia. And Felicia is not affiliated with a particular faith, organization. What you raised, though, is important. Rita and I sit on something called the Faiths program out of the San Francisco Foundation. And I know that there's been talk about, especially right now, making these virtual online gatherings possible. I can tell you that when our foundation funders saw what we were doing and we kicked into gear, they came to us with rapid response funding in order to enable us the capacity to provide Rabbi Dan and all of the other congregations in San Francisco with the information they needed to make informed decisions. And that was great for us. But at the Faiths table, I know that if I don't raise it, Rita's going to raise it. And it's going to be an issue on the table. So thank you. This has been very wonderful to raise ideas that we should be thinking about.
I adore that idea, Susie. Although I also don't have the technical know-how, but I could learn it. I just think that what a great way to actually create pathways for people to gather and to have prayer who otherwise couldn't. Irene Minkowski has a question. Yeah.
Yes, it's a little bit in the same line, and it's actually wondering, Mr. Pappas, if between the different religious belief, the different groups, we can actually coordinate a participatory involvement in determining or influencing, for the matter, the plan to return to the religious buildings. So that not just wait for the plan to come and see if we like it or not, but to implement.
No, and thank you for that, because what we have done is we have provided the public health officer with, if I could show you the massive material from each one of our jurisdictions, and this is what they were waiting for, because they can't treat us the same way they would treat a supermarket.
Yeah.
And so if you could see the sophistication of the internal reports that we provided them, however, the city does have a legal responsibility to revise the public health orders to make sure that the people in the city and county of San Francisco are safe. What I'm seeing, though, Irene, is that I think that the precautions that the congregations are ready to take are more proactive than what we're going to see from the city. The only thing I've asked of the city is to be specific, because the guidelines that came from the governor's office were just those. They were guidelines, and they were not specific intentionally. But I think what we're going to see that does come down is just to provide some direction to our congregation leaders and governing bodies of the congregation, that they have a legal responsibility to provide, almost like the city's doctor and lawyer.
Right. And so the follow-up to that, my question is, if the rule is you can reopen your building, does it then depend on the participants to go in or not in? Or is it the role of the synagogue, for instance, to decide if this doesn't look safe enough, or do they get some recommendation for not opening?
The one thing, just like the guidelines, whatever comes down from the city is not compulsory. Okay.
Oh, okay.
And that's very important. It's not compulsory. The synagogue can open when the synagogue feels it wants to open, when it is prepared to open, and when it can keep its congregants safe.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. One of the questions that I've had as the rabbi is, I think we all want to see each other and we want to be back praying with each other. And I know some of us here on this call can't actually physically be there, even if we could reopen, is do we want, a socially distanced 10-person minyan where there's no singing and people are all covered in masks and they can't say hi to each other anyway? I mean, is that is that what this community actually wants? And one of the things we're talking about at Beth Shalom is putting together a survey in anticipation of the high holidays, which is, okay, if we have high holiday services and we are open and you can come in, will you? Or will you not? And then, another question could be, if we provide recorded services, will you watch recorded services or will you not? If we provide live services, will you watch live services or will you not? Part of this, I think, is, you mentioned earlier, the pivoting around this is first of all, we have to figure out our priority has been preserve life, so shut down. Then we have this other justice element, which is, well, there's life here, so now we have to balance fighting those two issues. And then simultaneously, we have to figure out, we want to reinitiate worship again, but we want to reinitiate it in a way where people can actually worship and not just, I worry that saran wrap worship isn't going to be much worship at all. That is my concern, I guess, just from being a pulpit rabbi, where my head falls into. And this is part of the way that we're going to have to go forward, because we do want to reopen, but we also want to reopen in ways that are fulfilling, and as opposed to the opposite. Yep, please.
It's a secret. Now, there's only 40 people on this line.
Yes.
So our secret can be held here. I know that. For instance, at some of our larger anchor institutions, the Easter services were pre-recorded.
And did people watch them? Did they like that? Is there a difference between pre-recording and live?
Well, so they were done live in this. So when you have to understand, we were the last folks that had to move out of our sanctuaries, okay, our public spaces. However, between the governor and the city, they realized that these online services were going to be a lifeline to a lot of people.
Yes.
So the one thing you mentioned, and I guess we've been creating minions in all other traditions, because
indeed. You stole that from us. I'm kidding.
We stole it. But so what's happening is a maximum of 10 people are in these houses of worship of all the other traditions, and that includes the camera people, and they are producing worship.
And I think that's right. I think that, and I've been talking to a lot of rabbis, and rabbis, as somebody mentioned, have been trying to figure out how can we utilize technology in a way that adheres to tradition while also responds to the crisis at hand. And, I love the way that you frame that, is like, can you get people there that are engaged, even if it doesn't look like the way it normally looks, even if it might, I don't know, seem not kosher in a way from a perspective 40 years ago, is it genuinely felt? Is there genuine emotion there? And I think, somebody mentioned one of the decisions of the conservative movement allowing it. If you read through some of these opinions, at some point they become so farcical that it's like, part of that opinion is use the mouse with your left hand if you normally use it with your right hand, or push the button with your elbow. At some point, I think it leaps off of reductio ad absurdum. And I think our challenge of this community, and I think it's been the challenge, just as you mentioned, of the diaspora history of the Jews, is to figure out a way to create authentic community in a way that can bring people together. And vis-a-vis the minyan, I like to say the medium is the message, which is a little bit of my reticence around technology. The medium is the message. And the message of the medium of Judaism is the minyan. And I think that's why so many people are on this call right now, and so many people are very desirous of getting back to be with other people so that we can share that shared experience. But at the same point, just like you said, it's pastoral. So much of what we've been doing as a community is pastoral, and so much of it is creating, I love the way that you put that, a lifeline to members of our community who perhaps are home, who are by themselves, and who want to be connected. And by the way, I was actually saying the other day, we've been doing these very regularly, and someone popped in who I hadn't seen. I go, I haven't seen you in a long time. I realize I haven't actually physically seen any of these people here in a long time, but we do see them a lot. And I see Gary, and I see Judah, and I see Irene and Judy and Ben, and there does, it's the best of what religious communities do. It holds us together in these moments. Are there any other questions for Michael? Steve and Ruth, yes. You have to unmute, Steve. Steve, I can't hear you.
I'll do my best to phrase this as a question, but with regard to the interfaith demonstration where the clergy were not engaging in social distancing, and I will also mention parenthetically that Mayor Breed herself most certainly did not engage in social distancing as demonstrated by a picture in the Chronicle. What discussion is there about the effect of attending this rally on clergy's moral authority? I mean, like, how are they going to have the authority to say we are not going to allow more than a small fraction of the seats to be filled? And also about the power of example, because if priests and rabbis and imams are standing within 5 feet of each other, let alone 30, then why should we congregants hold ourselves to a higher standard than them?
I really appreciate Stephen's question. Yeah, Michael.
Well, and I will share with you, we were all a little shocked at one another on Monday. I think that there was such a concern about the issue at hand that we forgot that there was a pandemic going on. Let me come back to it though, Stephen. I remember I was invited to this press conference with the mayor. And if you've ever watched any of her press briefings, everybody who goes up to the microphone, they in the place that we are, everybody is very far apart. There's a discipline. There's a modeling. I will say we were not good models yet there. And
okay, I am personally shocked and outraged by this. And will the Interfaith Council do anything to rectify the situation? Because as far as I'm concerned, just speaking from a Jewish point of view, there is a synagogue where I have on occasion gone to services where 3 rabbis were there. They did not observe the guidelines. And the picture of one of them was in J. And I don't know that I can go there anymore because I don't respect those rabbis now.
Yeah.
I am thinking about writing one of them to express my outrage about this. But what is the Interfaith Council going to do to rectify what?
Yeah, thank you, Stephen. I really appreciate that question because this was in my own moral calculus.
So
wondering myself, and when I called Michael earlier this week on Monday to invite him to this, it was the first question that I brought up, which is the pull to want to attend and to be invited, while at the same time, for the last 3 months, I've been saying one thing to the congregation.
So I started receiving a lot of calls, even the morning of this gathering, because people were under the impression that this was sponsored by the Interfaith Council. And I found myself in every text response and every response by phone saying that this was not sponsored by the Interfaith Council, and that in fact, the Interfaith Council is not hosting any events because we cannot ensure the monitoring of social distancing and PPE and all of these things. That said, I did attend because Reverend Brown asked me to be there. There were several attempts at it, but it was not. And the council, by the way, is not a police authority. And we don't have the authority to impose anything on anyone. We can, through conveying messages and doing all of these things, we can get the information out, but we can't force anyone to do anything. An example being, we several years ago, in 2014, we formed an Interfaith Essential Housing Task Force to help congregations who wanted to repurpose their properties for low-paid workers. We call them essential workers, to have a place to live and not be forced out of San Francisco. We did that in order to show support for our congregations, but but it was clear from the beginning, and we let everybody know, we can't tell a congregation what to do with their property. And so just like I can't tell Rabbi Dan how to, and I would never think of telling Rabbi Dan how to run his synagogue, what we can do is we can get the information out there. We can strongly urge and recommend. And I will tell you, this what I showed up to, I did not expect. And so I think that we all learned a lot of lessons. But I am concerned, and I know that the Department of Emergency Management is concerned that the more the protests go on, that these could be hot spots for a resurgence of the pandemic.
So I just we've hit 1 o'clock and we've gone over 1 o'clock. So I just want to thank Michael, not only for coming and for sharing the space with us, and not only for coordinating so much of the important work that's happening in the city, but also for just sharing your honesty right now in response to Stephen's question. I think a lot of us are getting caught up in emotions, in righteous indignation, in anger, and I think it's very impactful for me as a member of the clergy to see you to say, hey, I got caught up in that myself, and I forgot that we were in the midst of a COVID. I think that's a very powerful example to set for all of us in the midst of this very trying time. So I just want to thank Michael for joining us and appreciate all that you are doing for this community. And we look forward to being a part of these efforts, obviously to repair the justice system in this country, and also to come together really as a community of faith here in San Francisco. So kol hakavod to you, all of the honor to you and the work that you are doing. And really a great thank you for joining us and for sharing your wisdom with us this afternoon.
And continue to do tikkun olam.
Amen. All right. Take care. So long, everybody.
Bye.
Wonderful afternoon.